Marc, Vandermeer, John Harris with you with General Manager Nick Caserio on Texans Radio. And Nick, take us through a little bit of the process here. What's it been like getting ready for this draft with your staff, with the coaching staff? You guys have been entrenched for a little while now.
Oh, it's been awesome, Marc. We've spent a lot of time collectively, both staffs kind of independently with the coaching staff, kind of getting some of their feedback and some evaluations on some players and interfacing that with some of the things that we've accumulated to this point from a scouting side, and just trying to, bring those two together so that we're just trying to identify kind of the right players that we think we like or would be able to have, we think, hopefully some role in some capacity for our team, whatever that looks like. So there's a combination of factors that go into it, but I think the work that Lip and Baz and their respective staffs have done to get us to this point has been exemplary. So, we're excited about the opportunity in front of us, and we're just going to try to maximize our picks whenever those are and just be prepared to pick like whenever that is. So it could be, probably not until much later on Friday, but like we're, looking forward to it and just trying to take advantage of the opportunities that we have in front of us.
Nick, obviously last year we had a combine, but no pro days. This year we've had pro days, but no combine. Do you find one better than the other or just different?
It's a good question, John. I would say probably more different, but I don't think like the information or the evaluation specifically from the workout standpoint is any different, right? I think the beauty of the combine is that he had a centralized hub, right, and location where there was 300 or so players-ish roughly, right? So you're able to accomplish a number of different things, right? Interviews, meeting with players on a face-to-face basis, medicals, and then on-field, right? So you're able to do that all in one spot. This year it's a little bit more fragmented, right? Because essentially you have the pro day, which you get the on-field, right? But there's nothing else that could take place at the school. So in the medical, there's 150 that went to Indy, so you're getting that information, right? And you're doing the interviews over Zoom, right? So it's a little bit more disjointed and in terms of how you have to do it, but you're still trying to arrive at the same endpoint. So the beauty of the combine, it's just kind of centralized. It puts everything in one spot. This has just been a little bit different, but I wouldn't say that it's been less effective.
Nick, when you make trades, obviously you have to do it so fast with so little time between picks. Do you lay the groundwork ahead of time for potential deals? How do you handle that in advance, or do you just wait till you're doing it on the fly?
It's a really good question, Marc. We've done it kind of both ways in the past, right? And depending on where you're picking, right, trades are so player driven, right? So a lot of that is contingent upon what happens in front of you and as the players come off the board. So we're at 67 right now, right? So to try to make any calls about trades or moving is probably not realistic at this point. But again, if you get to a certain point, you're looking X number of spots, and you're looking at some of the resources that you have. Okay, how much is it going to take for us to get here? There's a specific player that we want. All right, is it actually feasible for us to do it, right? So we've handled it both ways. We've done it both ways, but those are very organic. I wouldn't say there's necessarily a set formula to them.
Nick, maybe you can help me with this too, because as I've gone through kind of my own analysis for the draft, one of the things that I get to this kind of stopping point at certain points about players, and I'm not sure what to do. And that's the opt-out situation when players opted out. And there were all kinds of them. Ones that opted out back in June. There were some that opted out before the season started. There were some that opted out right in the middle of the season or with 2 or 3 games left to go. I haven't found kind of my own methodology for how I want to factor that into their ranking or their slotting. How have you looked at the opt-out situation? Is it case by case, or do you have kind of a universal thought on how you look at it?
John, it's a good question. You just have to go off whatever information that you have, right, and just make the best assessment, right? So the players that opted out just have less, I would say, playing experience recently, right? So do you penalize them for that? Or if they made an individual decision, do you penalize them and use it as a negative mark against, well, like he wasn't there for his teammates or just something like that, right? Which sometimes there's some of those statements. Again, case by case, look at the player, look at the information. You have hopefully 2019 that you can evaluate, and then you benchmark it versus 2020. And maybe you don't. And even the players that played in 2020, right? Like some teams played 4 games, some teams played 5, other teams played 10. So it's not apples to apples, right? So you just look at those situations. And again, you're just trying to make as good of an assessment as possible with the like we can't make up the information, right? So just you can only go off of what you have. So you just take what you have. All right, maybe it's a little bit less than you might have for somebody else, but that's okay. It shouldn't necessarily factor too much into your ultimate decision. But again, it's just makes it a little bit more challenging. And, you just they just have less, you just have less to go off in those particular situations. That's all.
I know you were asked about this, but I always find it fascinating. Need versus best player available. And if there's a really good player available, but you really don't need that player, do you think about dropping down because you might need another position group a few picks down? You think, well, I could drop down here. And those decisions have to take place so quickly. So how do you handle all of that, Nick?
Yeah, Mark, it's a great question. So what you have to do is you're working through the draft and the players are coming off, right? And you're kind of looking at the players graded at different levels, right? So you're kind of looking at supply and demand, right? And I don't want to simplify this to basic economics, right? Okay. Well, you're looking at one position. All right, we have 3 or 4 guys here. Okay, if we lose this one, we still might have a chance if we did this, right? Okay, is it worth moving back to get an extra pick? Or you know what? Don't want to risk it, right? He's too good of a player. We have a consensus. Coaches like him, scouts like him. He's a good person. He's got good traits. Okay, how smart are we to kind of get too cute, right? So again, you just have to assess the information real time and then just look at whatever the alternatives are and then decide okay, what makes the most sense at that time.
Nick, you mentioned it a little bit in your press conference, and I know people around here don't love talking about Julian Edelman, but I think there's something to be learned from his draft in 2009 where he was a quarterback, but you guys knew he wasn't a quarterback. You weren't totally sure what you were going to do with him. What sort of did you learn from Julian Edelman, the player, and how did you factor that into future drafts?
Yeah, I mean, look, credit goes to Bill on that one because he kind of, had the vision, but I would say it's just – you're just looking for good football players, right? I think sometimes you get caught up in certain measurements, height, weight, speed. Okay, this guy lacks length. I would say just my experience, and I would say even in the case of the Texans, right? Some of our better players, like Brandon Cooks, he's one of our better players, right? I think we all can agree on that, okay? He's 5'9", 190 pounds with elite speed, right? Okay, yeah. So he's a good football player, right? So because he's not, 6'2", 220 pounds, again, you can't get caught up in that, right? So yeah. In Edelman's case, he had good athletic traits. And again, you took a guy in the 7th round. It's not like you didn't know. And he made himself into the player he ultimately became because of his work ethic, because of the coaching that he received from his position coaches, and just his overall willingness to improve and get better, right? So what you want to see on any player, and especially players like that who might be transitioning, is their willingness to embrace that change, their willingness to improve. And the only way that you're actually going to get better is you have to work at it, right? And it's not going to happen overnight. And in his particular, it took him 4 or 5 years ultimately to get to a point where he was able to have some sustained success.
But you mentioned it talking to the media, Nick, about is the guy going to go to work or not? And how difficult is that to identify as a college kid? Is he going to put the work in? Because they all need to get better as they get to this level. So how do you see that in somebody?
Mark, that's probably one of the hardest things to ascertain, right? Because you don't know how they're going to respond to some of the other elements that come along with being a professional football player, right? Mm-hmm. There's a few more distractions. There's some other things that can kind of lead you astray, right? There's more competition. Nobody's on scholarship. You go from being on a roster of 80 to 5 to 90. Okay. You get to keep 53 players on your team, then there are 12 on your practice squad. So basically, let's call it, you can work with 65, 70 players, right? So are you doing enough on a day-to-day basis to account for one of those spots, right? Do you deserve one of those spots, right? So nobody's handed anything, regardless of where you were drafted or where you were picked. Again, that's not going to be our mindset, right? It doesn't really matter what round he's drafted in, where he comes from, or how he gets here. It's about what you do when you're here. And the sooner those players realize that and understand that, the better off they're going to have, the chances they're going to have for success, right? But you kind of articulated it. That's the most difficult thing. And you can't measure it, and you don't really know it until you actually see it and they actually get here, right? And that's probably one of the more challenging things that you face, because you can only rely on so much information. He's a great kid. Oh, he was great. Okay, well, that was in college, right? This is a totally different situation. How are they going to adapt? How are they going to adjust? And do they actually embrace this as a profession, which is what it is?
Nick, where do you see the strength via position in this draft? It feels like it's a great receiver draft. Obviously, 4 quarterbacks could potentially go top 4. where do you see the strength in this particular draft class?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's like a popular question every year. I'd say there's different pockets of different players, throughout, throughout the certain positions. I would say have a little bit more depth than others. I'd rather not get into like what certain positions, John, but there are certain positions. There's a little bit more volume, a little bit more depth.
Sure.
But again, you can really hopefully find football players throughout. And again, once you kind of get into that, 5th, 6th, 7th round, I mean, you could probably lump 5th to free agents, undrafted free agents in the same bucket. There's a little bit more hit or miss with that group, but hopefully there's enough players to get you to the end point. And there's probably going to be some good players that weren't drafted. I mean, it happens all the time, and everybody's looking, going, how did this guy not get drafted? It happens every year, right? So there's no rhyme or reason. Again, that's why the draft, it's just, there's no exact science to it.
It's okay. You don't have to tell us about the depth of the kickers in this draft. It's okay. We know it's great. Don't worry about it. It's all right. Kickers are going to be great. Got it.
Nick, how are you guys going to spend Thursday night? Are you in the war room like it's picks as usual? I'm barring a trade. You don't have any picks in the first round. So how do you spend Thursday night one of the draft?
We're going to have a staring contest. We're going to have beanbag toss. No, I mean, again, I think the good thing for us is just kind of go through our process, right? Set up the team boards. If there's trades that happen, okay, how do we move? So going through our process, like we can still simulate that and go through it and just understand there's going to be probably, 55, 60-ish players that are going to come off over Thursday to Friday evening. And again, you want to be respectful of the process, and there's certain things that we can do. We can have some discussions about maybe some particular players, or again, just trades happen. Okay, what was a trade? Okay, and just go through the mechanics. This way, when we actually get to that point, whenever we pick, it's kind of seamless, and we just haven't sat around and done nothing, which hopefully we won't do.
Well, we appreciate the time very much, Nick. Thanks a lot for joining us. Best of luck in the draft.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to know when we post new content.